Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. It's a deep honor and a pleasure to have Martha Ronk and David L. Ulin with us today. Martha will read first, and then David. Martha Ronk has published 12 books of poetry, a short story collection, and an ironic memoir, Displeasures of the Table. Her most recent publication, The Place One Is, Omnidon Press, examines the ways in which place changes one's self of self and is also connected with threats to the environment. Transfer of Qualities, prose poems, was long listed for the National Book Award. Vertigo was a National Poetry Series selection. Her work has been selected for several anthologies, most recently, American Women Poets of the 21st Century, Wesleyan UP. She was a professor of English at Occidental College in Los Angeles, teaching Renaissance literature and coordinating the creative writing program. Here's a brilliant poet, Martha Ronk.
Thank you, Harry. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good. Okay. Yes, I'm going to actually read from my most recent book, which I don't know if you can see this here. The Place One Is. What I was interested in was trying to fuse with the things that I was seeing, both in Northern California, which is the first part of the book, and in Los Angeles, which is the second part of the book. I think as a child, I imagined walking through walls and becoming one with things that were outside of me. And so I took that up in this book, and it was especially prominent to me, I think, because of being up in Northern California on the water and the sense of fog and mist and collapsing into what's around you. So I'll read some from the first part and then a couple from the second part, which is on Los Angeles itself. So this is called Where One Is. The place one is the place that is one, nowhere else. And although I can think myself back into some places, where one is the only place, and everyone's feet change underfoot as wet sand, concrete pebbles, and smooth change and operate on the particular tree out the window, one branch hanging down. Oh, Robert Adams, I do think of your black and white photos, but it's a cypress tree hanging down outside the window and sending out fingers of that certain green, not the various gray you do so well, since one can't be otherwise than an equation of such enormously specific greens. And one cannot be otherwise than where one is knit into it, beyond window glass, a fusion with a wind-shaped tree. This takes place in Northern California, in Arcata, on a trail that's called the Malal Trail. There are no trees on the beach. It goes on, and the water is so cold, no one swims. And on Malal, the trees are being swamped by giant dunes migrating over them as wind blows grains of sand into the air. And they hang there until they're over the top and falling on ragged limbs and ragged tree hair, smothering the tree, until each tree kneels into the sand. And over the years, the slump of the dunes alters the landscape. The movingness of the world is right with us on this trail, moving country into country, one history wiping out another, upending a familiar world, shifting and moving over cities, lives, shoulders too weighted down to think with, no matter how little or much one knows. Shifting sand moves over trees, fills up ponds and lagoons, chokes a night with images of future migrations extending into where we are walking. This is a special land that is sacred to the Wiyot tribe, and so the name Malel Trail actually belongs to them. And I really enjoyed being in a place where the evidence of people who had lived there before was sort of on the surface, and you could see it in the names, in middens, and in the language that was around me. They are, unlike those of us in LA concerned with trout, they're concerned with rising waters, which are going to flood certain of the roads and some of the small towns that are up there as the ocean warms and rises. So this is a poem called Into Rising Waters. Under the various moons, various translations thereof, so many vacant lots, Mattia poppies, trash and abandonment, thistles, rusty blackberries, coyote brush, tires, see-through pale flax, clumps of fog heave back and forth as if they were mammalian, labial creatures pulsing earthward, then into cloud-shorn skies. Each iteration, a different tidal moon torn into papery scraps. Refracted light burns my eyes, a cramped muscle turns the street lamp blue. Under the rubbery step, the gravel gives way, restless wheat stalks akin to what muttering is like under her breath. In another room, talking to herself, thin and high-pitched, underpinning whole fields of words. A lens of fresh water floats on the heavier salt water under that. If you push the weeds, a marker stands where the winter tide was high. Rising seawater will swamp a nearby town, the bridge, the Mad River Slough, the low-lying fields where the cows lie and stand, the graffiti-covered barn. One of the things I've always been interested in is black and white photographs. And there are some really gorgeous ones by a photographer named Robert Adams. I mentioned him in an earlier poem. But this is called a photograph by Robert Adams, Night. Ordinary bits of light on neighborhood leaves. Trees passed by, spattered not very white on a random number of them. The canopy of leaves wide enough to hold multiple bits of light. And what I can't help is how pulled I am into the lights, as if my eyes could focus on multiple places at once, which I know they can't, and yet my body, flattened and splayed, spreads itself over the leaves, and the branch never lowers or moves, simply stays as it is, as I'm pulled from each limb and finger, head and elbow onto the tree, as if I could just lie there, elongating out to the extreme endpoints. Not in my neighborhood, but in his Longmont neighborhood in 1976, when at that time I was nowhere near. And yet the online photo allows me to move entirely into a night and lights scattered, I suppose, from an ordinary street lamp on the sidewalk. and the tree branches, and it must be summer, given so many leaves. I think all of us, as climate changes and so forth, become fascinated and interested in saving the trees and in what they are and the ways in which they're all connected by fungi underneath the ground and so forth. Anyway, I certainly have been. So this is another poem called Night Trees. Each tree sticks itself upward dark into light, or lights the medium for each to define itself aslant against air saturated with water. Pixelated molecules diffusing the already diffused source of light. So few here, so few houses, few on the street. The homeless cyclist crossed noises crossing the highway. Uneasiness tossed in empty bottles off to the side. Infirm gullies underfoot. Past the corner, sudden quiet. Sun removal from all else. And then there's each tree. Its leafless sticks, some quiver in haze, some gather themselves, rising up into Japanese brooms, an inventory of the tightly bound, stiff, and ancient. And there they are, numerous V's in and above, and one's own upright, seemingly held in lower down, lost in the dark, conjunction. And then turning to Los Angeles, this section of the book is called The Familiar, Unfamiliar. My sense that this place that I live in and have lived in for so long continues to remain unfamiliar, that it's just so large and so diverse and so ungraspable a city. And so I wrote these poems called The Familiar, Unfamiliar. And as I did that, I realized that part of the reason was I was unable to recognize myself. So I was really interested all the way through this book in the parallels between what's out there in the landscape and what you're carrying with you. Recognizing oneself. The body is no longer what it was, more and along the sideways sort of thing. Each part struggling to keep up with other struggling bits and limb forms. In the dream, I am bagging up leaves and sticks blown in by a mighty wind. In every corner of the weathered barn, dragging, sweeping, sweating. Yet the master shows only the back of a raincoat and refuses our efforts on his behalf. Was it my kung fu master who had us kicking the air on a floor waxed with dancer's wax? Was it Sifu, now dead himself, who said I could keep the quilt if I liked, old and dirty as it was? Wrap yourself up at night, he said. How often the dream is bagging up against a leaking present. Endless sweeping, not as leading to anything, but a useless effort in a structure near collapse and in need of repair. As the apartment where I sanded the floors and painted them deck white, as if, and always as if. But these days, I wouldn't do it, would break the silence, wouldn't recognize myself any more than I already do. The end poems in this section are based on Raymond Chandler's novels. I got interested in the beautiful descriptions not the plot, but the beautiful descriptions that were in Chandler's books. And so I wrote a number of poems called the Big Sleep poems. And so I thought I would read a couple of those. So this is from Raymond Chandler. What did matter where you lay when you were dead, in a dirty sump or in a marble tower on top of a high hill? You were dead. You were sleeping the big sleep. You were not bothered by things like that. Marlowe gets up and walks around the orchids and mops his brow. His underarms are damp. Chandler inserts obvious metaphors. They unseat the scene. A few locks of dry white hair clung to his scalp like wildflowers fighting for life on a bare rock. Nothing to do with the case. Faces erased into objects wearing creased trousers and pencil skirts. You can't think in a poem or case like that. If orchids have the fleshy skin of old men, what can you do but fill in the blanks or take the bottle of rye out of your back pocket? I can see it as if in a photograph, arranged to droop or take on a sheen, as if it had been around a while. Arranged, the operative word. The Big Sleep 2. And this is again the description from Marlowe. The blue carpet darkened a shade or two, and the walls drew back into remoteness. The chairs filled with shadowy loungers. In the corners were memories like cobwebs. Expanse of blue carpet scuffed up a dusty whiff of it, from the still air of the street to the still air of a complex where anyone's been before. The entryway to a hunch. Architecture's the map of mystery. The uncertainty of an elevator, its momentary glitch, somewhere beyond the door is somewhere to get to. Stalled. The first paragraph of a chapter describes the foyer, the furniture, and some insufferable emptiness, the weight of the unplotted, the material stuff of ironic surprise. And this is from Chandler. Inside, in the square, barren lobby, a man put a green evening paper down beside a potted palm and flicked a cigarette butt into the tub the palm grew in. The startle not of blackmail, but of the green evening news. Since when? Another mystery, another time. Murders in the details. The Big Sleep 3. This was another day, and the sun was shining again. No wonder we're cooped inside, Santa Ana's in the driver's seat, down the dingy side streets, empty of shadows to slide into. Later, as if on the lam, zigzagging from treetop shade to treetop shade, sidestepping the direct glare, can't help a mirrored return to. Eyes as windows to the soul, so the guy said, tracking her disappearing heels. For him, too, a couple of scotches. For him, too, useless swallows. The need for a weather shift to settle settlements. Like cement shoes, one's innards. General Sternward formed by an economical smile, a wooden gaze. It said identification with character is jejune, but who's it then looking back from a mirror over the bathroom sink, rubbing a chin? There was no sensation in my head, The bright glare got brighter. There was nothing but hard, aching white light, multiple reflections, unshaven. So that's Marlowe, obviously. And I'm going to close with the poem called Familiar, Unfamiliar. And it's about walking. And there's a quotation at the beginning from Baudrillard. A city noted for its horizontality, largely inaccessible without a car, the inability to climb aboard, the loss of one kind of mobility substituted by the command, walk, walk. So this is about walking. It's right out there, and yet it escapes me, this city I ought to live in. I do live in. And when the morning comes, I walk wherever it takes me in the circle that is my street and the circle around that. And I take this walk with variations associated with the hour and my so-called ability, as one part won't work as it used to work. And the so-called hill, once a regular part, is no longer included as it was in some earlier walks of my walking to know where I lived, what plants and birds, what dogs have disappeared into 8x11 signs on telephone poles, or how the jogging, swinging, climbing parts of what's done continue in ways both routine and arcane. As taking it all in becomes a failed practice, as elusive as what walking is, or might be now to a life in which one never thought about it. Now one always thinks about it all the time in this new stage, in which it is good for you, no longer getting from here to there or just out for a walk, but something different from what it once was. And whatever I finally think about walking, I do think that it makes the familiar unfamiliar and more like the city I live in.
Well, thank you, Martha, for that,
Thanks so much.
For that wonderful reading. I've admired your poetry since 1977 when I first met you. So it's always a pleasure to hear you and to see the different subject matters, you know, whether it's your concern and love of the environment or black and white photos, Raymond Chandler novels, walking. I love to walk too. I walk, you know, probably 2 or 3 miles every day. So
Yeah.
I'm with you on all of those. I have a couple of basic questions to ask you. But first of all, I don't know if I said this, but what I wanted to say to you was that listening to your poetry, I see a sagaciousness, keen observations, very precise use of language, very superlative use of language, and also a stately beauty in your poetry. So I wanted to just tell you that. But what I was going to ask you is a couple of simple questions that I ask most people here who come on the show. When did you write your first poem?
I wrote my first poem in grade school, and I remember, I can tell you exactly. I realized, I used the word poppied to mean falling asleep, you know, and it came from The Wizard of Oz. It came from the way in which Dorothy falls asleep when she's crossing the poppy field. And of course, in those days, I had no idea why that happened. But I used the word poppied and wrote a poem. And then, of course, we had those poems that you had to write at holiday time. But those were different because I felt there were sort of things that I was obliged to put in. Whereas the one that had to do with the sense of crossing a field and falling asleep in the poppied fields was something that I don't know, it was so thrilling to know that you could take this scene that you had in your mind and turn it into what, you know, was for you anyway, a poem. And my mother was somebody who read a lot of poems and also recited out loud. So that isn't writing one, but it was around. So.
And what is it? I know you write prose too, memoirs, essays. You're a scholar. what is it about poetry that attracts you to the poetry form?
Well, I think concision, that sense of trying to say things in a more concise way than I do when I write prose. But the one thing I would say is that there's a kind of strain through everything. I'm really interested in the relationship between the verbal and the visual. And part of that goes back to teaching Shakespeare's plays, which I did for a very long time, and to the sense of the ways in which, because they didn't have backdrops and they didn't have scenery, that the creation of that was out of sort of whole cloth. That is, the characters had to say something that made you think you were in the Forest of Arden or at Elsinore or wherever you were supposed to be. And I really like that. And yes, and I'm very interested in art and in ekphrastic poetry. That's what I'm working on right now. Poems about the sea and based on paintings. And I've always been interested in trying to do that. But I think if I hadn't moved to LA, I don't think I would have written poems. There was something about how strange it was to me, and how I needed somehow to inhabit it. I don't know. And I'm still working on it. So you can see it hasn't gone away.
You know, I met you through my late wife, Holly, and another friend of Holly's, you probably knew him, Amin Alwan, who was a poet and a gardener. And one time Holly asked, Amin, why do you write poetry? And he said, you don't have to type so much. And she spoke that at a memorial for him. I thought, you know, I've always, you know, seen that, your observations in nature of the external. I've always noticed that. And you're always, to me, an artist. You're not only a poet, but there's an artist in the way you work at your craft. So I'm very grateful to see you. I haven't seen you for a while, and it's great to hear
I'm very happy to see you too.
And it's great to hear your poetry. And so thank you very much, Martha. And our next poet is David L. Ulin. David L. Ulin is the author or editor of more than a dozen books, including The Lost Art of Reading, Books and Resistance, In a Troubled Time, and Sidewalking, Coming to Terms with Los Angeles, which was shortlisted for the Penn Diamonstein Spiel-Vogel Award for the Art of the Essay. He has received fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation, the Lannan Foundation, and UCross Foundation. He is the books editor of Alta Journal and a professor of English at the University of Southern California, where he edits the journal Air/Light. Most recently, he has edited Didion, the 1960s and 70s, and Didion, the 1980s and 90s, for Library of America. Here's a marvelous poet, David L. Ulin.
Thank you so much, Harry. I really appreciate it. I'm delighted to be here. And thank you, Martha. It's a real honor to be reading with you. That was fantastic reading. So I'm going to read a few poems. One is I'll start with a new poem, and then the other poems are from a manuscript I've been working on. So we'll talk a little bit about that as we go along. And the first poem is just called Char. Wake at dawn to sun singed red through the cathedral window. 11,000 acres, zero containment, sky as raw as if a hot coil has been pressed into its neck. 200 miles southwest, the burn accelerates. Sunday morning barely underway, and already I am wondering how long until we pack the car. I'm going to continue with a selection of poems from this manuscript I've been working on for the last several years. I realized looking at these poems, preparing for this reading, that there are a number of themes come up. I read a lot about family. I read a lot about mortality. I read a lot about sort of the temporary nature of experience. And so this is a poem called Everything That Counts. Write like you mean it. Write about the things that count. Write about the face of the building on West 70th Street where your grandmother breathed her last, blood pooling beneath the skin of her face, blotches red as bruises as she sprawled head down across her double bed. Write about the bar on Columbus Avenue where Ray worked. A year of football, dice, bad jokes, that guy who asked her on a date, remember? And she wouldn't tell you what he looked like, so that each time you came to see her, you would glare at all the regulars, head twisting right and left, like a quarterback trying to read the play. Write about what happened next, how he promised to take her on a helicopter ride around Manhattan, and she accepted to get back at you perhaps for not leaving when you told her that you would. All that fall, making plans for California, only to back out at the last minute, just when she'd begun to imagine a new life. And yet he too backed out at the last minute, stood her up, left her waiting while you paced all night unknowing. And when it came time to console her, tell the truth, you could not. Smug instead with vindication, calling him names, making her feel bad for ever having believed him, for ever having wanted to believe in anything but you. Write about this ending and that beginning, all of it unfolding within a couple of blocks. Write that your grandmother's death was the least of it, that it was life, Ray's life, your life, that made you want to fight. Write about how much it matters, how unmoored you felt, how lost. Or no, not lost, be honest, but betrayed, shattered by existence, by the weight of everything that counts. I tend to write a lot about my kids. In fact, today is my son's 28th birthday. You'll hear a couple of poems about him. And so he makes an appearance in this poem as well, as does my daughter. And the poem is called Porch. It's a mid-city Los Angeles poem. Early mid-July, late on a Sunday, avenue so empty I can imagine almost I am somewhere else. Then a burst of fireworks and a jet descending into LAX. I am on the porch, riding out this heat wave, not waiting for my daughter, although I know that's what she's thinking when she returns home early from dinner with friends. It is the last summer before she goes to college, and since graduation, I have watched as she has molted, shedding us as if we were old skin. These milestones, they mark us just as the years do. They are what render us distinct. This summer, I will pay attention, not allow these moments to slip away from me, refuse to let them slide. And yet, who knows really what will happen? Here I am, perhaps a beer or two beyond my limit, sitting in the quiet, porch lit low. My son, he installed these lights, not last year, but the one before that, after he moved back in the first time. Now he is living here again, for summer only, or at least that's what we've agreed. He's at work now, will be home by 2 or 3, or whenever the club closes, although the last few nights I haven't heard him, which makes me wonder what attention means. Is it vigilance or relaxation? Is it a holding on or a letting go? Instead of deciding, I remain outside, feet propped on the wrought iron of the garden rail, while in the distance the city emits its low and ambient buzzing, like a rumble in the chest of the earth. To the south, another run of fireworks, although the holiday is past us. A car creeps up the avenue, but no one can see me. A siren echoes in some other corner of the night. But after, stillness, silence. Although the city is not quite sleeping, it is inhaling, catching its breath as a breeze stirs, first one in days through all this searing swelter. And above my head, the leaves of sycamore and elder rustle, reminder that in the morning, or even now, the world will wake, will start to move again. This is an older poem written not long after I moved to Los Angeles in the early 1990s, and it's called The Way Things Are. Last night, she tells me that I deserve to be happy, but I don't even know what that means anymore. We're walking home. I've got a belly full of beer. Our friends are still back at the bar, and I'm feeling for the first time in a long time like a part of something you might call community. Yet I'm not at ease. Haven't been for a month. Got your face etched so deep in my mind I can't see around it. Got your voice so lodged in my ears that all I hear is you asking me, what the fuck are we doing? Like a guilty secret only I can know. Earlier, I tried to tell someone about you, but I couldn't find the words. Anyway, words are just a way for me to dance around what's really going on, which is that I love her, but I cannot disconnect you from my heart. The next three poems are 3 out of 4. I left one out for reasons I go back and forth on it. But the series of poems I wrote called The Four Elements, one for each of the elements: water, water, fire, earth, and air. And I'm going to read the water, earth, and air poems. This first one, the water poem, is called Pause. All night rain, an atmospheric condition, spattering like birds shot at my window, rattling the metal gutters in the alley by my bed. And now in the morning, it's still coming. Front garden flooded, sky dark and hooded, porch light a bleary blur. 6:15 a.m. I put up coffee, put off going for the paper, sit in dark and melancholy still. The day starts with a caesura, and I'm grateful for the quiet, although I know this flood will carry me away. This is the earth poem, Vertigo. And I should say it's styled to look as it looks like a newspaper column, which will, when you hear what it's about, will make sense, like an obituary. In San Francisco this morning, the air shaft outside my hotel window grays as if a fog has settled in. Red brick wall facade of windows, angle of the street in the near distance, 6 stories below, a city that still feels like home to me, except that I am alone in a small room, tidy as a ship's cabin, unfamiliar and familiar. Picasso nude print on the wall, not unlike the one I had in college when I met my friend who died last weekend, my friend who is not my friend any longer, is not breathing, is not dreaming, is not with her children, with her desolated husband, is not aware or caring that I did not visit when she was in the hospital, in a room not unlike, I imagine, this one, in a city where she does not live anymore. What we have is the ground beneath our feet, Gary Snyder cautioned in a documentary I just saw. But my friend is dead, and I did not say goodbye. Now I stare through the window like Jimmy Stewart in a Hitchcock film, wondering how I find the ground beneath my feet when all I see is blurred. And then this is the air one. It's called Above the Fray. 30,000 feet over the Rockies, clouds like the expression of a dozen nuclear explosions running south to north, a line of demarcation as if we were flying across the front lines of the final war. So this next poem is called Simone Weil, although it's not exactly about Simone Weil, although maybe a little bit about Simone Weil. It's dedicated to my birthday son, and it's a kind of a miracle we've gotten here, and this poem will tell you why. It was written in 2013. I keep thinking of Simone Weil, about whom I know just enough to worry that my son will follow her extreme example, not towards activism, but starvation. She died in 1943, age 34, wasted by disease and hunger, refusing to eat, in solidarity with the French living under German occupation. My son is not like that. He has never cared particularly for the big issues, although he is a loyal friend, the one others count on to make sure they get home. So why can't he care for himself? Adrift in a life where every meal is a potential act of treachery, where the only occupying army is that which camps out in his soul. Soul. Weil was concerned with the soul also. It may have been what killed her, this mystic's faith in reconciliation, brought up short by a world in which communion seems a futile gesture and prayer is just another form of wishful thinking, the child's what-if game. Weil was no child, but she died uncompromising, unregenerate. Or is it more accurate to say that she died of love? Either way, I can't help thinking about her parents, whom she led to America to escape the Nazis, and how they felt after she had martyred herself on a cross of her own making, how they felt after she was gone. What good is love, after all, if it can't sustain us? I ask myself this question all the time now, a prayer, a silent whisper, wishful thinking, aware that there is no one listening, and yet unable somehow to make myself stop. I'm going to read a couple of older poems now as well. I think 3 older poems. This is a poem that was originally written a long time ago in the early 1980s and then went through a lot of revisions. So it was first written when I was about 20. And it went through a number of revisions before it was finished. And it's called July 4th, 1980. I think this is the first of 2 poems that use dates as titles. I often like to date poems or put dates as titles, because I think there is a kind of diaristic aspect to some of the poetry work I do. And I've written longer diary poems as well. I had thought about reading one of those, but it seemed a lot for a single reading. So this is July 4th, 1980. That day I was in the back seat, just 5 friends out for a drive. When the car rolled, things moved in slow motion. I turned to the others and said, "We're upside down," as we yo-yoed over again. I did not see my life, only the wall in the windshield like a big brick hand signaling stop. And we stopped. After the moment had cleared, the 5 of us sat in a Highway Howard Johnson's freezing in the summer heat. We all would have liked a cigarette, suck in and watch it burn down like the lives we almost lost. This is a poem called Clean Living. It's a domestic poem, also from the late 1980s. I think I wrote this poem about 1989. As part of putting together this manuscript, I've been digging through a lot of old work as well as new work. And so it's interesting to me to kind of see what work, what work perseveres and what doesn't. This is one that seems to me to have persevered. So Clean Living. I'm sitting on the couch, reading one dead poet and listening to another. Just scrubbed the bathroom and dusted the coffee table, put away my books, finally sorted through all those magazines, let them go. And now I'm done. Had a drink and a few hits of pot, waiting for Ray to finish vacuuming so we can hit the shower, slip wet and sleek between clean sheets, where long, slow love is its own poetry after house cleaning on Saturday night. And this is the other dated poem, or a poem with the dated title. It's called February 15th, 1999, which is the day it was written. Monday afternoon, sitting in my stripped bare office, listening as Robin plays his downstairs piano and feeling the crush of all these moments, all this living that we've done. In the back room, Sophie sleeps, while Ray sorts clothing, packs it up in boxes, getting ready for the move. It's been 8 years that we have lived here, and the ghosts are thick as silence, pushing against me in the fading winter light like little whispers in a tapestry of half-heard words. Both my children were born here. How do you explain that? Or the way that moving feels like leaving them behind? The collection that I'm working on is called Last Night on Earth, which is a phrase that popped into my head. I really like. This is a poem. This is the title poem, Last Night on Earth. It was inspired by a bunch of things, but part of it involved, if you remember, that airliner that disappeared a number of years ago. And I was traveling and flying at the time, and I was intrigued by the notion that a plane, tracked, radared, et cetera, could simply go off the radar in a kind of almost Twilight Zone type way. Of course, the mystery was much more mundane, but not at the time the poem was written. So that's the sort of starting point, although it's not really a poem about that. Last Night on Earth. I put on my red shirt and danced through the soot and sorrow of a late winter evening in old New York. Cobblestones peeking through the pavement like pebbles in a path made of macadam. Darkness a cloak obscuring stars and satellites, all of it lost in the immensity of a universe, utterly indifferent to our travails. I am also lost, as adrift as a jetliner off the radar, depressurized, unconscious, asleep at the wheel. Where will I come down? The Indian Ocean or some uncharted jungle? Will I disappear into the clouds? Whatever. Let me shed these cares, these heartaches, and spin until I dissipate, a speck, an atom, brief spark flashing in oblivion's contrails. We can read a couple more poems. This is the second to last. This is, again, for a long time, I wrote poems wherever I was. I liked writing poems on napkins. I particularly liked writing poems on bar naps. If I was sitting with a friend in a bar. That all stopped, partly, I think, because of the pandemic, because I stopped going out and stopped going to bars. But this poem is called The Final Poem I Will Ever Write on a Bar Napkin. And it's a fragment. It was a fragment of a poem that I found years later, and carved the poem out of the fragment. It was an incomplete set of lines, but sort of buried within it was this poem. And so this is the final poem I will ever write on a bar napkin. Here we are in all our damaged flesh, which is true, but also beside the point. More, I'm a soul trapped in this aging body, temple that breaks down as temples always do. The soul is not the heart. It is an oversimplification, not even remotely the same thing. But where do I pray then? Where is the pulpit of my blood? And then the final poem, another son poem. So happy birthday to him. This poem is called Our Sun Comes Over. It was just written last fall and came out this year in a journal, and now has been anthologized in a book. So maybe it's my greatest hit. I don't know, but it's called Our Sun Comes Over, and it's a pandemic poem. I think it's the only pandemic poem in this batch. It's the second week of August, and already I have spent too much time with too many people, inhaled their breath, their flumes from the other side of an outdoor table or within an enclosed living room. What do vaccines mean in the face of Delta or Lambda or Omega? Which will be the variant that kills us all? What I mean is there are crossroads in our future, although of course that is how it always is. And yet I don't want to dwell on that this evening. Better to inhabit the moment while it lingers before we have to hide ourselves away again. Our boy stopping by on his drive from work for takeout dinner. My wife and I so thrilled to visit with him, you might think we had discovered a brand new source of joy. Yes, there are crossroads in our future. Trouble riding at our left shoulder like a car coming up fast in the side view on a highway late at night when you are somewhere you have not been before, and the pavement is an empty river, and you feel lost, not knowing where to turn, which is the direction home. In a life where we are stalked by death, we are all ever having to decide. So we sit at the table with our son, our beloved who has come over to see us, aware of the risk, but also recognizing that risk is, how could it be otherwise, the only way of love. Thank you very much for listening. I appreciate it.
Well, thank you for that outstanding reading, David. It's a pleasure to hear your work is personal. Your love of family is evident. And, the poem that you wrote about Simone Weil almost seemed like a prayer to me. And that one poem where you said that it was about, I don't know if it was in the poem or you said it, but where is the pulpit of my blood? Mm-hmm. You've always, outside of your family, it always seems to me that from just knowing you a little bit, the pulpit of your blood is certainly in literature. I mean, you have such a love of literature and also nature. And, there's also deep compassion in your work, and some of it's loving, and then some of it's elegiac. So it's nice to hear your work and getting to know you a little bit more. I've read your prose a lot. You've written many outstanding, to use the same word again, in articles about literature in the LA Times, which we're all thankful for. But I will ask you the two same questions I asked Martha. When did you write your first poem?
It's funny. I was thinking about that when you asked Martha. I would have said probably ninth grade. That was, I think, when I wrote my first kind of self-consciously. Well, I guess I was first conscious of kind of the forms of poetry. But I realized I had started writing poems because in fifth grade, our English teacher assigned us to create, each of us in the class to create an anthology. It was the first time I'd ever heard the word anthology. And he wanted us to write in a variety of forms. So he wanted some fiction, he wanted some other things, and he wanted some poetry. So I wrote a few poems then. So I'd have to say fifth grade. And the poem that I remember writing for that anthology was what I thought of at the time as an epic poem. I sort of was familiar with the Iliad, but I had no real idea what it was. But it was a long poem, about 8 pages, telling the story of David and Goliath. And the reason I mention it is that I was aware without being aware. I was aware of the cadence I wanted, which was a kind of I'm Jewish, but I was not raised religious, but I wanted this kind of rabbinical chant, almost this sort of almost this kind of Kaddish kind of quality to the rhythm of the poem. So I remember writing these lines with that rhythm in my head without actually knowing what I was doing. But I think that was probably the first experience of trying to create a poem.
And what is it about the poetry form that attracts you to it?
Well, I think that for me, I would say brevity. I mean, concision was Martha's answer, which I agree. I think that there's a kind of snapshot quality to it. As a prose writer, I'm a bit of a maximalist. I write long sentences, long paragraphs. I write books and essays. I mean, I can write short, but I tend to want to bring in the whole world. For me, the poem is really, most of my poems, I think, are really moments. They're either bits of reflection or they're descriptions of a particular moment. They don't necessarily, there's a narrative quality to them, certainly, because I think in terms of narrative, but they don't necessarily have to have a narrative payoff. And I think that in the same way that I want a lot of that in prose, I find it a relief in a way not to have to worry about it in a poem, to let the poem stand for itself as simply a moment unto itself.
Now, I'd like to ask both of you to join on this right here. Something, I was born in 1940. I'm probably a little older than you, David, maybe about the same age as Martha. I'm not sure. But, I grew up, the first time I got into poetry was 1966 when I read the New American Poetry. And most of those people were anti-academic, as you know. And today, if you pick up a Norton anthology and you look at the bios, you'll see most of them are teachers. And a lot of what people talk about today are stories. And when we grew up, there was the way Paul Blackburn would use the whole page, or the way Olson would use the page. And there was a sense of form, people seeking form. And in the 70s, I know Holly, Lee Hickman, Martha, among others, a search for form. And I still see that in Martha's work. But could each of you just we have a few minutes left. Could each of you just take a minute or so and just what should we, today it seems like multicultural, multi-gender, et cetera, multi-ethnic inclusion and stories seem to be what's happening. But could each of you weigh in on a little bit of what you see, or what should we be talking about when we talk about poetry in our time? Martha, would you go first, please?
Yeah, I can't do this. I tend to write pretty lyrical poetry. But the person that I really admire, who has now died, was C.D. Wright, who taught at Brown. And I just think her books are extraordinary. And she was able to write work that was lyrical and documentary and narrative, and it managed to combine all those things and to write about what I thought of as serious topics. And that's what I look for. I mean, I like all kinds of poetry. I mean, I'm not like somebody who doesn't like this or that, but I found that that ability that she had just extraordinary. And when I find it, the other person who can do that, I think, is, I'm going to forget her name. Wait a minute. Gillian Connolly does that a lot too. So those are the kinds of things I look for. But I think, people need to write the things they need to write. And I don't think you can dictate to what young people are doing. They're going to pass through whatever they're going to pass through. And then, as we all know, we get older and something else happens. Fortunately, we have experiences. So.
And we're still doing it. David?
Yeah, I think that's a great answer. I'm always reminded of a friend of mine who was sort of, I don't want to say he was an undisciplined poet when he was younger, but was sort of eschewed traditional forms. And then after about 20 years of writing, he got very interested in traditional forms and started writing, writing sonnets, iambic pentameter sonnets with rhyme scheme, because he felt that the rules were offering him a different kind of approach to creativity. He was having to be creative in a different way to kind of use the rule, not bend the rules, but use the rules to make his own expression. And I think about that a lot. I'm not a particularly formal poet, but I do create forms. For instance, that first poem I read is 6 3-line stanzas. It's not, it was the form that organically grew out of the poem as it went from kind of note stage to final stage. But I think poetry is essential for a variety of reasons. I think particularly in the current moment, it remains essential because it is so immediate and it can be so short and it can be so digestible and so bite-sized. And particularly in a short attention span culture, one consumed by social media, I find myself writing a lot of haiku and posting them on social media. It seems like Twitter seems like a platform that's built for haiku writing in a certain way. And so I feel like we're always responding to both the culture and the platforms around us. I think that, for me, it's interesting. New American poetry, although I came to it later, was heavily instrumental to me when I discovered it in high school in 1970s, because I also was reading a lot of academic poetry. That was what was being assigned. And all of a sudden I was like, oh, these people this is poetry that's written in language that it's like, I can be in conversation with this poetry. I could do this. And so I think that, for me, and I don't know that that's changed. I think that a lot of us have moved into the academy because that's where the work is. And we need to eat. But I think that, I prefer to look at it as the non-academic poets have infiltrated the academy rather than the academy has co-opted the non-academic poets, I think. The poets I'm admiring, there are many, Ada Limon, who's now the poet laureate, I think is a remarkable poet. Claudia Rankin for what she's doing with form and content, and also for the political content, political components of her work. These are the poets I read and teach and keep coming. The contemporary poets I read and teach, or some of them that I keep coming back to.
Well, I want to thank both of you. It's been a very uplifting program and nourishing to me. So thank you, Martha, and thank you, David. And I just want to say before the next show starts that next Tuesday, 4 leaders of MPTF, Bob Beecher, Jennifer Clymer, Courtney Bailey, and Sharon Seifert will read their favorite poems. And so that's our show. And so thank you very much. And here's to the next show.